The tributes are pouring in tonight for the actor Patrick Swayze. He died at the age of 57.
Patrick Swayze was a legendary actor, dancer, and singer.
I love you. 2 words, 3 syllables. The last thing Patrick Swayze ever said to the woman he had loved for 34 years. And the last thing she said to him. There are men who become famous. And then there are men who become felt, whose presence reaches through a screen and holds something in you that you did not know needed holding. Patrick Swayze was the second kind. He was the man who made the world believe in love again with a single scene at a pottery wheel. He was the surfer-philosopher standing at the edge of a wave. He was the dancer who proved that grace and strength were never opposites. 57 years of living, 34 years of one marriage, and 21 months of fighting a cancer that most people do not survive for 6. But behind that legacy of legend lies a story not triumphant in the way Hollywood stories are supposed to be, but far more powerful. Because Patrick Swayze did not go quietly. He did not stop. Under chemotherapy, he showed up on set every day. Under pain that would have stopped most people, he danced in a kitchen in Chicago with the woman he loved. In New Mexico, on a walk that should have been ordinary, he looked at Lisa with tears in his eyes and said 4 words that broke everything open and put it back together at the same time. And when the end came, when the doctors had done everything they could, and the ranch in Los Angeles was quiet, his last words were not a speech. They were not a prepared farewell. They were the simplest truth he had always known. I love you. If Patrick Swayze has ever moved you, on screen, in memory, or in this moment right now, hit like as tribute to a man who proved that real courage is not the absence of fear. It is showing up anyway, every single day, for the people and the work and the life you refuse to let go. Because it is extraordinary, the way a life this full can also be this tender. And the story of how Patrick Swayze spent his last 21 months on this earth is one of the most remarkable things you will ever hear. Patrick Wayne Swayze came into the world on August 18, 1952, in Houston, Texas. Not the Houston of oil money and country clubs, the Houston of working neighborhoods, of heat that sits on your chest from May to October, of families that built what they had with their hands and expected their children to do the same. He was born into a household that did not separate art from discipline, because his mother, Patsy Yvonne Swayze, would not allow that separation to exist. Patsy was a choreographer, a teacher, a woman who understood, in the way only artists truly understand, that the body in motion is never just a body, it is a declaration. She ran a dance studio, and from the time Patrick was old enough to follow instruction, he was inside it. Not as a hobby, not as an extracurricular, as a way of life. While other boys in his Houston neighborhood were learning the language of football fields and baseball diamonds, Patrick Swayze was learning something older and harder and more demanding. He was learning how to make every movement mean something. His father, Jesse Wayne Swayze, was an engineer, a man of precision and practicality. And in that household, between a mother who lived in the music and a father who lived in the mathematics of the real world, Patrick was shaped by both. He inherited his mother's feeling and his father's focus. That combination, as the years would prove, was not ordinary. The dancing was not easy. Ballet, in particular, is a discipline that rewards nothing and demands everything. It is pain systematized. It is the body pushed past what it believes it can do, every single day, until the impossible becomes the ordinary. Patrick trained through that. He trained while peers laughed, because in 1960s Texas, A boy in ballet was not a simple thing to be. He trained through the mockery and the doubt, and the particular loneliness of being a person who feels things deeply in a world that is not always ready for that. But he trained, and he got better. And somewhere in those years of Houston's sweat and Patsy's studio and Jesse's quiet expectation, a performer was being built who would one day stand in front of hundreds of millions of people and make them feel, without a single word, that love was worth everything it cost. The beginning of a legend, it turns out, is rarely glamorous. But it is always this: a child, a discipline, and someone who believed before anyone else did. Patrick Swayze left Houston with a body trained in ballet and a hunger that Texas could no longer contain. He came to New York City the way serious dancers come to New York. Not as a tourist, not as a dreamer in the soft sense of the word, but as someone who had already paid years of dues and was ready to pay more. He studied at the Harkness Ballet School. He studied at the Joffrey Ballet School. These were not casual institutions. These were places where the most disciplined young dancers in America came to find out whether what they had was real. What Patrick had was real. He was accepted. He trained at the highest level the American ballet world offered. And then, at a moment when a career in professional dance seemed not only possible but likely, his knee gave out. A serious injury. The kind that ends trajectories. The kind that arrives without warning and rewrites everything a person thought they knew about their future. For a dancer, the knee is not just a joint. It is the instrument. And when it fails, the silence that follows is not just physical. It reaches into every plan, every hour of practice, every sacrifice made to get to that room in New York. Patrick Swayze could have stopped there. Most people would have. Instead, he made a decision that would define the shape of everything that came after. He did not abandon performance. He redirected it. Theater, acting, the stage in a different form. He began pursuing roles, building technique in a new direction while keeping everything his body already knew. The movement, the musicality, the physical intelligence that years of ballet had drilled into him at a cellular level. None of that disappeared when the knee gave out. It waited. And then, in 1975, two things happened that would anchor the rest of his life. The first was a woman named Lisa Niemi. Lisa had come to Patsy Swayze's dance studio in Houston as a teenager. 14 years old, a student taking classes from Patrick's mother. Patrick was 19. He was older, already formed in certain ways, already carrying the particular intensity of someone who has committed completely to something and knows it. They met in that studio. They began as people in the same world begin. Slowly, then not slowly at all. The connection between them was not the convenient kind that Hollywood manufactures for press tours. It was the inconvenient kind. The kind that rearranges your life. On June 18, 1975, Patrick Wayne Swayze and Lisa Niemi were married. He was 22 years old. She was 18. They had known each other for years by then. Known each other in the particular way that dancers know each other, which is to say, completely. There is very little you can hide from someone who has watched your body under the pressure of movement and discipline. Lisa had seen Patrick, and Patrick had seen Lisa. And what they saw, apparently, was enough to make a promise that would last for 34 years, through fame and illness and everything the world would throw at both of them. The second thing that happened in those years was that Hollywood began to notice him. Small roles at first, the kind that pay enough to keep going and teach you more than any classroom. He appeared on Broadway in Good Time Charlie. He built a reputation as someone who could do what very few actors could do. inhabit a body on screen with complete authenticity. Because Patrick Swayze was not pretending to move like an athlete or a dancer. He simply was one. And the camera, which catches everything, caught that. The roles grew. The recognition grew. And somewhere between the dance studio in Houston and the stages of New York and the early sets of Hollywood, a performer was assembling himself who would one day stand in front of the entire world and become, almost overnight, its most unlikely romantic icon. He had not arrived yet, but everything was in place. The discipline was there, the hunger was there, and Lisa was there, the fixed point around which everything else would eventually orbit. The question was what it would take to make the world see what those who knew him already knew. There are films that perform well. There are films that become hits. And then, once in a generation, there is a film that does something else entirely. Something that cannot be planned in a studio meeting or engineered by a marketing department. Something that reaches into the audience and rearranges something permanent. Dirty Dancing, released in August of 1987, was that kind of film. And Patrick Swayze, at 34 years old, became that kind of star. The story of how he got there is not a story of overnight luck. By the mid-1980s, Swayze had been building steadily. The Outsiders in 1983, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, where he stood alongside a generation of young actors who would go on to define American cinema. Red Dawn in 1984. Youngblood in 1986. He was present. He was working. He was the kind of performer that directors respected and audiences remembered, even when the films themselves were not yet worthy of him. Then came Johnny Castle. The role of Johnny Castle in Dirty Dancing was not considered a guaranteed success. The film had a modest budget. It was a period piece set in the summer of 1963 at a Catskills resort. It was a dance film at a time when dance films were not considered serious commercial properties. There were doubts. There were people in rooms who did not believe in what they were making. Patrick Swayze believed in it completely. He threw himself into the preparation the way only someone with his particular history could. The choreography was not a challenge to be managed. It was a language he already spoke. What he brought to Johnny Castle was something beyond technique. He brought the specific ache of a man who lives in his body so fully that everything he feels expresses itself in movement before it can be contained in words. That is not acting in the conventional sense. That is a performer offering something true from a place most actors cannot reach. The film opened. And then something happened that no one had planned for. Dirty Dancing made $32 million in its opening weeks. It would go on to earn over $214 million worldwide against a budget of approximately $6 million. The soundtrack, featuring the song I've Had the Time of My Life, became one of the best-selling albums of the decade. The film spent 112 weeks on the home video bestseller charts. These are not the numbers of a modest hit. These are the numbers of a cultural moment. But the numbers are not the story. The story is what happened in theaters across America and then across the world. In the dark, when Patrick Swayze lifted Jennifer Grey above his head at the end of that final scene, and the music swelled, and every person watching understood, without being told, that they had just witnessed something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. A generation of people learned something about desire and dignity, and the refusal to be ashamed of what you want from that film. And the man at the center of it, the man who made Johnny Castle feel like someone you had always known, was Patrick Swayze. He was not supposed to be the romantic lead that Hollywood built its architecture around. He was too physical, too intense, too genuinely himself. Hollywood, in the 1980s, had a particular template for its leading men, and Patrick Swayze did not fit neatly inside it. What he was instead was something rarer. A man who moved like a dancer and looked at his scene partner like she was the only person in a room that contained the whole world. Women saw that. Men saw it too, though they might have described it differently. Everyone felt it. 3 years later, in 1990, he stood at a pottery wheel opposite Demi Moore in Ghost, a film that would be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture and earn over $500 million worldwide, making it the highest-grossing film of that year. The scene that everyone remembers, the clay, the music, the hands, is perhaps the most famous romantic image in American cinema since Humphrey Bogart said goodbye at Casablanca. And Patrick Swayze was at the center of it, doing what he had always done, making you feel it without explaining it. Then came Point Break in 1991. Bodhi, the surfer-philosopher who robs banks, not for money, but for the sensation of being fully alive. A character so unlike Johnny Castle and so unlike Sam Wheat that it proved definitively what the film industry sometimes forgets, that Patrick Swayze was not a type. He was an actor, a genuine one who could carry a film on the specific gravity of his presence alone. By the early 1990s, he was one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet. The face, the voice, the way he occupied physical space. These were known quantities in living rooms and cinemas from Houston to Tokyo. He had achieved the particular kind of fame that very few people ever reach. Not celebrity, which is surface, but icon status, which goes deeper. People did not just know who Patrick Swayze was. They felt something when they heard his name. And through all of it, the films, the money, the magazine covers, the screaming audiences, the pottery wheels and the lifted bodies and the crashing California waves, Lisa was there, not as an accessory to the story, as the story's fixed point. The person to whom he came home, the person who had known him before any of it, the person who, when the world got too loud, made the quiet possible. What happens then when the body that carried all of that, the body that danced and surfed and fought and lifted and loved, begins to betray the man inside it? It began with a burning sensation in his stomach, not dramatic, not cinematic, not the kind of opening that a screenwriter would choose for the third act of a life like Patrick Swayze's. Just a persistent discomfort, a heat in the abdomen that would not resolve, that kept returning, that sat beneath the surface of ordinary days on the set of The Beast in Chicago, and quietly insisted on being acknowledged. He was 55 years old. He was working. He was doing what he had always done, showing up, throwing himself into a role, refusing to treat his body as anything less than fully capable. He went to the doctor. 3 weeks later, in January of 2008, Patrick Swayze received a diagnosis that rearranged the rest of his life in a single conversation. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. One of the most aggressive malignancies in human medicine. A cancer that arrives late, announces itself without mercy, and in the majority of cases, in the vast majority of cases, claims its patient within the first 6 months of diagnosis. The 5-year survival rate for stage 4 pancreatic cancer at that time was approximately 3%. 3%. The doctors were honest with him, the way doctors must be honest when honesty is the only thing left they can offer. Patrick Swayze had been a chronic smoker for more than 40 years. At his peak, he smoked up to 60 cigarettes a day. 60. A number that is almost impossible to hold in the mind. More than 4 packs every single day for decades. He knew it. He acknowledged it openly. In interviews after the diagnosis, he admitted that the habit had, in his own words, probably had something to do with what the doctors had found. He did not deflect. He did not construct a narrative of victimhood. He said what he believed, and he moved forward. Because moving forward was the only mode Patrick Swayze had ever known. He began chemotherapy immediately. And then he did something that stunned the medical community, the entertainment industry, and everyone who heard about it. He went back to work. Not eventually. Not after a period of recovery and adjustment. He returned to the set of The Beast in Chicago while actively undergoing chemotherapy treatment and continued filming the series that would become the last work of his professional life. The logistics of this were staggering. Chemotherapy is not a background condition. It is a full-body assault. Nausea, exhaustion, the particular disorientation of a system fighting itself at the cellular level. Most people receiving stage 4 pancreatic cancer treatment spend their days managing the treatment. Patrick Swayze spent his days on set, in character, delivering performances that critics would later describe as among the finest of his career. He played Charles Barker, an FBI agent operating outside the boundaries of conventional law, a man of extreme methods and buried conscience. The role required intensity, physicality, emotional precision. He gave it all three every day while his body was waging a war inside him that no camera could see. Lisa was there. She had always been there. But now there was a dimension to being there that neither of them had anticipated or prepared for. She learned to give him injections. She, who had her own fear of needles, learned this intimate and painful skill because it was what the situation required, and because she was the person who had promised, 34 years earlier, to be present for everything. The paparazzi found them in Chicago. Photographers pursued their car through the streets, chasing the story of the dying movie star, until Lisa was forced into evasive driving maneuvers just to move through the city with a degree of privacy. His brother Donnie tried to shield him when he could. The world had decided that Patrick Swayze's illness was public property, and the world pressed in from every direction. In the middle of all of this, he gave an interview to ABC News that people still return to, not for the medical details, not for the prognosis conversation, but for what it revealed about the man himself. He looked into the camera, and he said, "I know I can beat this thing. I have a huge support network behind me." And then he said something that contained, in one sentence, the entire philosophy of a life. "I've got a love affair with life. I'm just gonna fight like hell, and the chips fall where they may." A love affair with life. That phrase did not come from a publicist. It did not come from a crisis management team advising a celebrity on how to handle the optics of terminal illness. It came from Patrick Swayze, the boy from Houston who had trained through mockery, who had rebuilt a career after his knee betrayed him, who had stood in front of the world and made it feel things it had forgotten it could feel. A love affair with life was not a performance. It was a description. It was the most accurate thing he ever said about himself. About the work, about continuing to film while receiving treatment. He was equally direct. "Do I want to work?" he said. "Absolutely. It's the best therapy in the world." And there, in that sentence, is something important to understand about Patrick Swayze that biography sometimes misses. For most people, work is what you do when you are well. For Patrick Swayze, work was part of what kept him well. The set was not an escape from reality. It was a form of reality that he knew how to inhabit completely, where the discipline and the focus and the physical commitment that had defined him since Patsy's dance studio in Houston could still be fully expressed. To stop working would have been to surrender something more than a salary. It would have been to surrender a version of himself, that he was not willing to let the cancer take. The Beast aired on A&E in January of 2009. 12 episodes. The reviews were serious, respectful, often genuinely admiring. Critics who had spent years writing about Patrick Swayze as a star reconsidered him, on the evidence of that performance, as something more precise, as an actor who had perhaps never been given material equal to what he was capable of. The cruel irony of that recognition is not lost on anyone who has paid attention to the arc of his career. His finest critical reception arrived when he had the least time to receive it. And through all of it, the treatment, the filming, the interviews, the paparazzi in the Chicago streets, the injections that Lisa learned to give because love sometimes asks you to become someone you were not. Through all of it, the 21 months kept moving. One day at a time, one scene at a time, one treatment at a time. He had said he wanted to fight like hell. He meant it, literally. But there were also moments, quieter, more private, more true, that were not about fighting at all. Moments that were about something older than courage. Something that only the people inside a love story of 34 years can fully understand. What does a man like Patrick Swayze say when the cameras are off and the set is dark and the city is quiet to the woman who has been the fixed point of everything? There is a moment that Lisa Niemi wrote about in her memoir, Worth Fighting For, published in 2011, that does not belong to the world of film or fame or the machinery of celebrity. It belongs to the category of human experience that resists documentation, that happens in the space between two people who have known each other long enough that language becomes almost unnecessary. They were in New Mexico, one of their last getaways together, a deliberate choice to be somewhere that was not a hospital, not a set, not a city full of cameras and speculation. New Mexico in the way that wide-open land is its own kind of medicine. They were walking. A good day, the kind of day that becomes precious, precisely because it arrives unexpectedly in the middle of the hardest season a person has ever lived. The sky was the particular blue that exists only at altitude. The land was quiet around them. Patrick stopped walking. He turned to Lisa, and he had tears in his eyes. This man who had spent a professional lifetime projecting strength, who had surfed waves and fired weapons and lifted bodies above his head, and convinced the entire world that he was impervious to the weight of things. He had tears in his eyes, and he said 4 words. I want to live. Not a speech, not a prepared statement. 4 words that contained everything, the fear and the love and the refusal and the grief and the absolute unwillingness to let go of any of it. 4 words from a man who had said publicly that he was going to fight like hell. But this was not the public version of that sentiment. This was the private version. The version that does not perform courage for an audience. The version that simply tells the truth to the one person in the world who can hold it. Lisa held it. She had been holding things for 21 months that most people are never asked to hold. She had learned to give injections. She had driven through Chicago streets at speed to give her husband a few minutes of privacy. She had watched him go to a set every morning when the medication alone would have kept most people horizontal. She had been, simultaneously, a wife and a caregiver and a witness, and the person who kept the love large enough to contain all of it. The illness and the work, and the fear and the extraordinary, defiant joy that Patrick Swayze refused to stop feeling even when everything around him was contracting. And in Chicago, on a night after filming, after another day of Patrick Swayze doing what he had told the world he would do, showing up and working and refusing to let the cancer define the terms of his existence, Lisa put on music in the kitchen. And they danced, not on a stage, not on a set, not for a camera or an audience or a legacy. In a kitchen in Chicago under chemotherapy, Patrick Swayze danced with his wife. The man who had made the world believe in movement as a language of love used that language one more time, privately, for the only person who had ever needed to hear it most. There is nothing in any of his films, not the pottery wheel, not the final lift, not the wave at the edge of the world, that is more romantic than that kitchen in Chicago. Because those film moments were crafted and rehearsed and lit and scored and delivered to an audience of hundreds of millions. The kitchen in Chicago was just two people, 34 years of a love story that had survived everything the world had thrown at it, moving together in a room where no one was watching. That is what love looks like when it has no audience. That is what 34 years looks like. That is what Patrick Swayze, underneath the icon and the legend and the global fame, actually was. A man who danced in his kitchen with his wife while his body was being destroyed from the inside, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was the one thing he had never learned how to do. As 2009 moved forward, and the treatments continued, and the months accumulated, the ranch called. The property in Los Angeles, the land that Patrick and Lisa had made into something that reflected who they actually were, away from the noise of the industry. Horses, open space, the particular silence of a place that belongs to you. Patrick Swayze loved horses with the same completeness that he loved dance and film and Lisa. They were not a hobby. They were part of the life he had built. The real life, the one that existed underneath the famous one. There was a horse named Ro, a stallion. One of Patrick's favorites. The kind of animal that carries its own dignity, that meets your eyes with something that feels uncomfortably close to understanding. In the final days, as Patrick was brought home to the ranch, as the medical chapter closed and the final chapter opened, Lisa brought Ro to him, so they could say goodbye, so that one of the creatures Patrick had loved could be present at the end of things. She placed a white rose on his chest. She hung an amulet above the bed. Small acts, enormous acts. The kind of acts that people perform when words have reached their limit, and love must express itself in objects and gestures and presence. And then she stayed. Not occasionally. Not in shifts. She stayed at his side with the constancy of someone who had made a decision 34 years earlier and was keeping it completely, to the very last possible moment. She slept with her arm around him, her head on his shoulder. She held his hand. She listened to music with him in the quiet of a room that was also now the most important room in the world. She wrote about it later with the particular precision of someone who wants to get it exactly right, who understands that these details matter, that they are the true record of what happened, that no summary can substitute for the specific truth of what those final days contained. I cherished our time alone, she wrote, holding his hand, listening to music, sleeping with my arm around him, my head on his shoulder, wordlessly. Wordlessly. Because some things, the deepest things, the things that 34 years of shared life accumulate into, do not need words. They have already been said. They have been said in dance studios in Houston, and on stages in New York, and on film sets across the world, and in kitchens in Chicago, and on walks in New Mexico, and in 34 years of ordinary mornings that turned out, in retrospect, to be extraordinary. What remained at the end were the simplest words in the English language. And he said them, and she said them back. Patrick Wayne Swayze died on September 14, 2009, at his ranch in Los Angeles, California. He was 57 years old. He had fought for 21 months against a cancer that most people do not survive for 6. He had worked through it, danced through it, loved through it, and refused, at every point where refusal was still possible, to let it define the terms of who he was. His last words to Lisa Niemi were, "I love you." Her last words to him were the same. There is a version of this story that focuses on what was lost. The films that were never made, the performances that were never given, the 57 years that should have been more. And that version is true. It is a genuine loss, not only for the people who loved him personally, but for anyone who has ever sat in a dark theater and felt something shift inside them because of what Patrick Swayze did on screen. That kind of presence does not arrive often. When it goes, it leaves a space that nothing else fills in quite the same shape. But there is another version of this story, and it is the one that Lisa Niemi has chosen to tell. Not because the grief is not real, but because she understands, with the particular clarity of someone who was present for all of it, that grief and love are not opposites. They are the same thing, seen from different angles. In 2014, 5 years after Patrick's death, Lisa married again. A jeweler named Albert DePrisco. She found, in the second half of her life, something she had not expected to find. Not a replacement for what she had lost, because that is not how love works when it has been as large and as long as what she and Patrick had built together. But a continuation, a proof of something. In 2022, when asked about the love she had carried for Patrick Swayze across the years and across the distance that death creates, she said something that deserves to be held carefully. Just because you lose someone doesn't mean love stops. 6 words. The same compression, the same simplicity, the same absolute truth as the last words she and Patrick had exchanged. Just because you lose someone doesn't mean love stops. It does not stop. It changes shape. It becomes memory, and it becomes legacy, and it becomes the reason that a woman who has every right to be defined by grief chooses instead to be defined by what the love contained. The dancing and the horses and the walks in New Mexico and the kitchen in Chicago and the 34 years of ordinary, extraordinary mornings. When Lisa was asked, in that same period, whether she believed she would see Patrick Swayze again, she did not hesitate. She did not qualify. She said, "Yeah, he'll be waiting for me, and that's a wonderful thing." That is the legacy of Patrick Swayze. Not the box office numbers, though they were staggering. Not the cultural moments, though they were permanent. Not the critical rehabilitation that arrived, with painful irony, in the final months of his life. The legacy is a love story that lasted 34 years, and then kept going. The legacy is a man who, when a doctor told him that the most aggressive cancer in human medicine had reached its final stage, said that he had a love affair with life and meant it without performance. The legacy is a kitchen in Chicago and a walk in New Mexico and a white rose placed on a chest by a woman who stayed, wordlessly, to the very end. He danced under chemotherapy. He filmed through pain that would have stopped most people. He stood in New Mexico with tears in his eyes and said he wanted to live. And when the moment came, when the ranch was quiet and the music was low and Lisa's arm was around him, he said the only thing that had ever needed to be said. "I love you." 3 syllables, the beginning and the end of everything that mattered. If Patrick Swayze has ever meant something to you, if Dirty Dancing played at a moment in your life when you needed to believe that love was worth the risk, if Ghost made you reach for someone's hand in the dark, if his courage in those final 21 months has stayed with you the way real courage always does. Leave a tribute for him in the comments below. Tell us what he meant to you. Tell us which moment you carry. And if this story has reminded you that the people you love deserve to hear it, not eventually, not when the moment is right, but now, then Patrick Swayze has done, from wherever he is waiting, exactly what he always did best. He made you feel something true. Subscribe to Golden Fame News for more stories of the legends who shaped our world, told with the reverence they deserve. He'll be waiting, and that's a wonderful thing.